Bill Kristol, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you very much. One of the things you said earlier was that Gorsuch would have been on the short list no matter who would have been president. And I'm very interested into why, if that were the case, this is going to be such a big deal.
No matter which Republican, I meant to say.
That makes a difference, because I was rather confused
No,
as to why the...
No.
Yeah. The other thing is I'm very much of an optimist myself, and I'm wondering why it is that more people are not willing to help this new president, regardless of what's gone on in the past. We're all in this together, and I wish that people would be more forthcoming with helping rather than criticizing. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it would be nice if he said that occasionally, because, honestly, if he asked for help, I think he might have gotten it. And I think Republicans have actually tried pretty hard, to bend over backwards to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm not sure after that campaign, Democrats were in much of a mood to do that in any case. But again, he could have done much more, honestly. I'm not a big apologist for Chuck Schumer and those people, but, he didn't do much to say, what are your priorities? Is there a bill, infrastructure is the usual example, that you guys were sort of on the same page as? Why don't we do that first? Why don't we show that there's... George W. Bush, who was elected after a very bitter, post-election 37 days or whatever it was in 2000, went out of his way to do bipartisan education legislation. I'm not sure it worked out so well. No Child Left Behind with Ted Kennedy. And I think one reason he did it, partly because he believed in it, but partly because he thought it was kind of important for the country to do something that would have a signing ceremony with a Republican president and senior Democrats from Congress. Trump seems to have had no particular instinct to do this. He didn't try to put a prominent Democrat in his cabinet, even in a job where, it might not have made much of a difference. So given that, the Democrats were not going to do much, honestly, to reach out. And Republicans, I do think, certainly in office, have tried pretty hard to be accommodating. Maybe people like me should have been a little more tolerant. But every time I want to be more tolerant, then he tweets something else, and then I was like,
But what about the classic thing, and the Supreme Court process brings this up, of the sense among Democrats that the past 8 years have been wholesale obstructionism from Republicans, and the difficulty then of Democrats, even if they want to come back. It speaks in a way, I think, to this sort of spiral of institutional disrespect, in a sense, that the more either side uses all of its leverage to its own benefit, the higher the likelihood that once there's a change, the overall tenor of things is going to go down another notch, and we seem to be seeing that now.
I agree. I think in foreign policy, the conventional view that it was totally partisan isn't really quite right. There were partisan elements, of course, of foreign policy, but we at the Weekly Standard, I think, supported his surge in Afghanistan, supported him on eavesdropping and NSA type stuff against the left wing of his own party. We were more mixed, I'd say, when his foreign policy, especially the first term when Bob Gates and Hillary Clinton actually helped shape the foreign policy, we were friendlier to it, not so much in the second term. But again, I think he could have done some things. There's more of a tradition in foreign policy still that you try to find ways in which to cooperate. But again, Trump, it would be very much in his interest to do this, incidentally, on trade, where Democrats, I agree with him more than Republicans. Why doesn't he call in, 10 Democratic senators who care a lot about trade, have some meeting? Maybe ultimately he wouldn't learn very much, but it would show that he wants them to listen. Why doesn't he put some Democrat on some delegation that he sends down to negotiate with Mexico, who has good relations with the labor unions? I'm not sure Trump disagrees with those kinds of Democrats that much, but I think he has made it harder to build that kind of bipartisanship.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Sure.
So we've kind of seen Trump during the campaign had a different tone on Russia than a lot of other traditional Republicans. And we've seen that, his cabinet's kind of split in it, and effective people like Secretary Tillerson and then people like Secretary Mattis. And we see Congress, we still have people like Senator McCain and Senator Graham. But we also have Democrats caring a lot more about U.S.-Russian relations. Yeah. So where do you see that going forward, particularly, now that we have investigations involving Russia's meddling in the 2016 election as well?
I guess it's amazing we didn't really mention Russia. There's too much to talk about.
They were telling me that in my ear, but I didn't do it. I disobeyed them.
So, one weird unintended consequence of the Trump presidency might be to make the Democrats more hawkish on a bunch of foreign policy issues, like dealing with Putin. Obama was the one who stopped us from arming with defensive arms Ukraine when there was a large majority of Republicans in Congress and many Democrats who were for it. So now, unfortunately, Trump isn't for it either. So we've elected the one Republican who agrees with Obama in certain ways on this. I think Putin's a very dangerous figure, actually, if you sort of look around the world and see a guy who thinks he's getting away with stuff and just keeps pushing his advantages. What's one of the things that worries me the most, I guess I didn't really raise it when we were talking about foreign policy, we talk more generally, but is what happens with Putin, with Trump, who seems, let's leave aside the possible scandals and all that stuff, and just say that he has consistently, ideologically, been friendlier to Putin than any other major American public figure, virtually. He has no concern for human rights and liberty and democracy issues, so that's one ground to oppose Putin. He also doesn't seem to have much concern for our traditional allies, or the people in the nations in the Balts or the Balkans, some of whom have been admitted to NATO, whom we, in the past, under both Clinton and Bush, and mostly Obama, have been pretty committed to helping and defending. Well, really, I'd say pretty thoroughly Obama, except for Ukraine, probably. So that's been a pretty big bipartisan tradition since the end of the Cold War. Trump wants to deviate from that. I mean, I suppose there are some foreign policy experts who will say, oh, there's a sophisticated argument for that. But I think when you look at it, it just looks like he's going to let Putin get away with more and more. And that's dangerous. I mean, if you ask how wars start, I think they sometimes start by us being belligerent, I suppose, or we choose, in a sense, to take a risk and go to wars in Iraq. But usually wars start when we look weak and people misinterpret that, or we say Korea is not in our defense perimeter, and then the North Koreans invade the South, and then it turns out, well, of course we're going to defend Korea. I think in the first Gulf War, we sent mixed signals to Saddam. He misinterpreted perhaps those signals and thought he could get away with invading Kuwait, and then, of course, the first President Bush said, no, we can't allow that. So I worry a lot about that. I mean, I think that Trump, the sort of liberal attack on Trump is this kind of madman who's Dr. Strangelove. This was a big theme of the Hillary Clinton campaign. I never thought that was effective. I don't think most Americans, he's not that way. He's not like Goldwater. He's not ideological. You can't even imagine Trump saying better dead than red or some really bold thing like that. He seems to be, he loves life in his own way, he's a kind of a hedonist and a, party guy and a rich guy, and he's not going to blow things up. The way we'll get into a war into Trump, I'm afraid, though, is more the retreating before bad guys around the world, and then saying, like, this can't go on, and then we sort of lash out, and maybe properly, in response, and then you get a kind of escalation. So anyway, I'm worried about Putin. I'm worried about what Trump's attitude towards Putin is.
Trump is getting assistance. His son, Jared Kushner, is appearing in places where you would expect the Secretary of State to handle affairs, where he's going. We don't know what he's doing. We don't know what he's saying. His daughter is reportedly the one who can talk him off the ledge from time to time and stop some behaviors. But what would you comment on that?
Some of my friends many of whom were in New York and sort of know them a little bit socially almost, are sort of hope that they have a fair amount of influence because they're less ideological, they don't really share Trump's view of the world in certain ways, they're younger, they're more worldly, and if that's the right way to put it, and they sort of hope that Jared and Ivanka can, sand off the rough edges maybe of the Trump White House and the Trump administration. And I guess that's fine if they can do that. I'm not going to complain about that. Having said that, there's something I find distasteful about the whole, let's turn the White House into a family business. I mean, I said this during the discussion, it's kind of there's something about the campaign that was a little third world almost, Trump is kind of more of a third world demagogue type. You expect to see a candidate like that more in Argentina than in the United States. But this is literally third world. Let's just bring the whole family in, and use them instead of the actual officers of the state who have been confirmed by the United States Senate, who are bound by all kinds of rules and regulations, who supervise bureaucracies, which, for better or worse, tend to make their behavior a little more predictable and routinized and so forth. And let's just have Jared Kushner go off and lay the groundwork for this meeting with Xi Jinping this week, the Chinese leader. Now, maybe it'll work well. Maybe he's a very smart guy, and maybe Trump trusts him, and he can do it. There's always room for some of that. It's just like in life generally. There's things family members can do that out of the normal course of things that maybe can help you as opposed to going through the bureaucracy. But that should be the exception, not the rule. And I am a little amazed that Jared Kushner is an assistant to the president. I think maybe now Ivanka is as well. how can you even have a staff meeting with this daughter and son-in-law of the president in the room? I mean, it would be like any other business. There's a reason businesses have nepotism rules, right? And indeed, the federal government has a nepotism rule, and passed after Bobby Kennedy had been John Kennedy's Attorney General. And we've never really had anything like this. Hillary Clinton doing the healthcare thing was, I guess, the closest in 93, 94. Pretty different situation, and incidentally, it didn't work well. If you talk to people from the Clinton White House, one of the problems was no one could quite tell Hillary Clinton, hey, you know what, the strategy, I don't think this is working too well, you know? So, well, it's Mrs. Clinton. You can't really talk to her the way you talk to some other, you know, senior staffer in the White House. And so it probably led them astray a little bit in 93, 94. But she was different, and had been, you know, involved in a lot of policy issues, and it was one issue that she really did. The idea that Jared and Ivanka are just free-floating senior staff in the White House is a little nuts. As I said to someone who had been in the Clinton White House, I happened to be with someone the other day, how could that even work? What is senior staff meeting like? You know, can you have an honest conversation about, gee, this tweet was ridiculous, what are we going to do about this? When Ivanka and Jared are there, and they're going to go back and tell their father, hey, you know, Doug, he's not really very loyal to you. You know, he just said your tweet was ridiculous. I mean, you know, really, it's kind of a problem. So, no, I'm very, again, that's another sign for me of, do you become president and say, okay, it's president of the United States. It's different from running Trump organization. It's different from the golf courses and the Trump University. It's different from being a candidate. It's different from everything. And I've just got to adjust and be serious about it. And it means putting people in who are not my close friends and not my family members. And this is something presidents go through. Clinton originally brought Mac McClarty, who I think was his friend from kindergarten or something, right, to the White House. Mac McClarty's a wonderful guy, incidentally, and an honest guy and everything. But he was not a good White House chief of staff. He didn't know Washington, and the first year was sort of chaotic. And then he brought Leon Panetta in, a very, you know, savvy Washington pro, who had no personal relationship to speak of until he got there with Clinton, and that worked out very well. Jim Baker had run Bush's campaign in 80. Reagan had the strength, I would say, really, when you think about it, pretty impressive, to make him his chief of staff in 81 over all the Reagan loyalists. Trump has not done anything like that, really. He's appointed some good people to cabinet officers who didn't have personal relationships. So I like that, you know, a Mattis or some of the others. But in the White House in particular, it's sort of people who got close to him in the campaign, and people who he likes personally, and people who are related to him. And again, you could imagine these cabinet agencies doing a pretty good job, but the White House looks to me like not a place well set up for successful policy execution.
Thank you again for coming to Charlottesville. Sure. I'm thinking about the voters who voted for Trump, and if he does turn out to be the false prophet that many of us think he will be, where will they go in the next election? And if there's a third party, what do you think that would be, and how would you describe it?
Yeah, that's a very good and obviously, you know, good question, which is very hard to anticipate this early on. I mean, so let's just back up a second. Most of the voters, I think I know what you refer to when you say the voters who voted for Trump, the distinctively Trump voters. But it is worth just making the obvious point. 90% of Trump voters were Romney voters. You know, I mean, most of the people who voted for Donald Trump have voted Republican in every presidential election in the last 20 or 30 years. Many of them didn't like Trump much. Many of them didn't vote for him in the primary, and they just thought, you know what, we'll get a good Supreme Court appointment. He'll be better than Hillary, whatever. You know, the economic policies will be a little closer to what I like, and hopefully in foreign policy, a lot of them thought, you know, he'll be constrained. And so one shouldn't overdo the Trump. I mean, it's a mistake to look at Trump, 46% of the vote, and think 46% are on board entirely on Trump. With Trump. And of course, that turns out not to be the case, since now he's at 36%, so already 10% have decided, ooh, you know, he's not quite. I voted for him. Maybe they still think they should have voted for him, incidentally, but they don't approve of the job he's doing because he's not learning, in a sense, the way they hoped. Now, there are the distinctive, let's say, Trump voters, the now famous white working class voters who are unhappy and disillusioned. You know, that's one thing I worry about, just from the point of view of the country, our social stability, is, you know, what if they voted for Trump, Trump does his thing, things don't get better. Maybe things get worse. You know, we have recession. Whether he's to blame or not, we're going to have a recession one of these days, probably. Could be in the next 4 years. Coal jobs do not come back to Kentucky and West Virginia. Auto and steel jobs do not come back to Western Pennsylvania and Northern Ohio. And then what? Well, maybe they decide, you know what, that was kind of just a con, or that was the guy making promises he couldn't keep. He was a false prophet. And I think, thinking about history here briefly, my limited knowledge around, sometimes false prophets come and go, and, people just go back to life, and they end up saying, okay, well, that was like a gamble, it didn't work. Sometimes false prophets come and go, and people get radicalized by it and decide, well, he didn't do it, he didn't succeed because he sold out. We need a real tough guy to show, change this country and make America great again. That's a dangerous scenario. And I think it's not an impossible one. You could have a situation in 2020 where you have a Trumpite Republican Party, he gets renominated presumably, and a Sandersite, let's just say, Democratic Party, whoever that would be. There would be then big room for a centrist party. And I don't know how strong the two-party system is anymore. It looks strong. It has been there a long time. There are a lot of institutional reasons. Political scientists have written a ton about this, why the system tends towards two parties. But you could imagine an independent or third-party candidate, or you could imagine Trump. I've always thought this was a little more possible than people think. What if Trump just gets disgusted with the Republican leadership in the Congress, and he's above all this nonsense, and he does some deal with the Democrats, gets a couple of things through with them, does a couple of deals with Republicans, fights with everyone, and just says, I'm an independent. I don't need this. This is, in a way, the Schwarzenegger model at the state level in California. And he just runs for re-election as kind of Trump. The Republicans nominate a Republican, and the Democrats nominate a liberal Democrat. I don't know. Then he only needs 35 or 38 or 40% to win, right? So I think there's a lot of fluidity in the system now. I do think Trump is an indicator. It may not be, incidentally. A lot of times people think things could really change, and then you look up 4, 8, or 12 years later, and they're pretty much similar. And we'll have in 2024, I don't know, Marco Rubio, Joni Ernst ticket against the Cory Booker, whatever conventional ticket. It'll be just like it's been in the past. But I think there's a higher likelihood than usual that may not be the case. That the parties could change in character, or the party system could break up in some way that we haven't seen in quite a while.
So I'm trying to reconcile a couple of statements you made in the course of the hour. On the one hand, at a couple different points, you expressed optimism with American institutions. On the other hand, you cite Bob Putnam and Charles Murray, who have sort of chronicled sort of the breakdown in institutions that Tocqueville talked about that would be sort of your bulwarks against executive overreach, et cetera. And then you throw in addition to sort of the breakdown of the family and organized religion, Congress is not doing so hot. There's concerns about the longevity of the current welfare state model. The media is not doing so hot. You talked about that. So where is your faith in American institutions coming from outside of maybe a different sense of American nostalgia?
That's a good question. I'm obviously uncertain about how strong. We don't know how strong these institutions are, how much they can recover, how much they have flaws that are fixable, and how much they have irreparable damage is done. I would distinguish. I guess when I'm saying the strength of institutions, I am thinking more politically in terms of civil liberties, basic economic policies, not turning us into a third world kind of crony capitalist state, even if we have slight tendencies that way under Trump. Same in foreign policy, NATO, U.S.-Japan alliance and stuff. So what I'm thinking there is, Congress, the judiciary, the media, to some degree even the party, I would say, and then of course the University of Virginia and businesses. I think most, the rule of law, lawyers. It was interesting on the executive order, for example. So that was something he promised his base he would do. Civil society, if you want to call it that, worked, right? Lawyers flooded airports and courtrooms and filed suits, and federalism worked. States filed, state attorneys general filed suits, and the courts responded. And that sort of shows me that we're not a third world country in that respect. The president doesn't get to say, hey, this, and everyone says, oh, okay, I guess this is now the law of the land. Same with healthcare, same with other things in that respect. So that's sort of what I meant by the institutions, more of a political view of them. I think culturally and economically, some of the problems that Putnam and Murray discuss and Eberstadt are real. I'm a little less pessimistic than they, but I can't say that I have any great reason in the data to see that. I just have the hunch maybe we're going through a bad patch. Maybe it's sort of some of these things are being slightly overdone in terms of how hopeless it is in working class America. There are worrisome data points, though. Social mobility does seem to be down. Actual personal mobility is down. That's a weird thing. If your prospects are getting worse, you would expect people, and this is the American tradition, to move to places where they have better chances. Now, in a way, it's also right to say, well, it's good that people don't have to move the way they used to. That was not a great thing about America, that there'd be a recession, that your job would go away, and you'd have to go 1,000 miles west to get a job, and you'd see your family once every 5 years. It's sort of nice if a family can stay together in a place you've grown up and all this. We were all happy about that. On the other hand, it's not great if people are just staying in a failing area, hoping for a job to come back. It's not going to come back. So the decline of labor mobility is a little puzzling. So I don't know, obviously. I mean, I think some of the social and cultural trends are more worrisome, family breakup. I'd say the political institutions actually strike me as being, on the whole, reasonably strong. Some of them, as you suggest, are unpopular, but they still function, and they still are pretty independent, I guess. Sometimes that leads to difficulty in making policy, so you could say, well, it's bad that Congress is that. Every congressman's his own boss now, and every, the media's crazily, has all these different websites, and, things are less well organized than they were 50 years ago. But I still think that's a pretty healthy thing for the country. And I do think you could argue that, as I say, the first 3 months of the Trump administration have shown, I guess the way I put it is that politically we're not a third world country. But I think socially, and I don't think we're a third world country culturally and socially either, but I think there some of those trends are deeper seated and more worrisome.
Well, I'll also say thanks for coming to Jefferson and Madison's turf. And I wonder what they might have thought about a sitting president calling the press the enemy of the American people. So I wonder if you could expand on that topic a bit. And whether the conservative press has a special role to play in this, because I thought it was interesting, sort of the market with those Macedonian teenagers trying to make some money off fake news. They found that when they tried to spread it on left-of-center websites, that it didn't go anywhere because somebody would comment, fact check says no, this is not true, and it would stop. But on the right, it kept going. It was almost like the immune system was not working because people would say, well, Snopes is biased, or Washington Post, Glenn Kessler's biased, whatever, fact check. And so I wonder if the responsible right-wing or conservative press has a special responsibility to sort of shore up that institution.
No, I think yes, and I think actually Steve Hayes made that point pretty eloquently in that New York Times piece that Doug cited, and we've always tried to say that. I mean, I think a lot of the reason the stuff spread on right-wing press is that it was pro-Trump, basically, and anti-Obama and anti-Clinton. So, of course, it was going to spread more on right-wing websites, and we'll now go through the experiment at some point, I suppose, of whether if some foreign regime sets up, 1,000 people in Macedonia to do anti-conservative stuff, would it spread as much on left-wing websites? I don't know, honestly. That's an interesting question. There's plenty of irresponsibility on both sides, but I do think 8 years of Obama led to a certain derangement almost in parts of the right-wing media universe, and then the desperate desire to sort of for a change, and then the wish that Trump, the kind of intriguing character of Trump, we lost with McCain, who's a war hero in many ways, I would say kind of a great man. Lost with Romney, a very distinguished figure personally of great integrity. And so now we need to try something different. And you can understand why people thought that. I mean, I can't tell you when people told me that over 2015, 2016, as I complained about Trump. And you can see why people say that. I mean, it's not a crazy thing to say, but once you start down that path, it's a little dangerous, obviously. You can sort of start talking yourself into rationalizing more and more and more. And I do think that happened even among some of the more responsible, I don't think among us, honestly, but among some of what you would have hoped would have been more responsible conservative politicians, as well as press. It's not just press mostly, it's mostly figures out there who were on TV who were not press. I mean, whether Newt Gingrich, Rudy Giuliani, people I would have said, you can like them or dislike them and have issues with what they've done, but I mean serious people in their previous jobs, major figures really in the last 25 years in American public life, suddenly rationalizing things that you sort of think they can't possibly believe this. This is ridiculous. I do know those people actually. They're smart people, and and fine. In the old days, if you're the guy on your side, your candidate said something you didn't agree with, you sloughed it off. Maybe you sort of, I don't know about that, but let me tell you, Doug, about this, and then you just answer a different question. But they actually liked, it seemed, defending Trump in some ways, as he said outrageous things. I think that was a bad sign of a kind of certain corruption maybe of, I don't know, of the conservative movement, but at least of some conservative leaders. My colleague Jonathan Last wrote a piece early, I'd say maybe late 2015, I think maybe early 2016, Trumpism corrupts. It's really, and then he wrote some updates, and I really recommend it. You can Google it, obviously. And Jonathan's point was, you start off, reluctantly defending. It's not as bad as you think. He's vulgar. He's kind of disgusting what he said about McCain and making fun of disabled reporter and so forth. But there are other things he does that are better, and maybe he'll work out okay. And you sort of start off there, which isn't a ridiculous position, obviously. And then you kind of, 2 weeks later, it's, I'm not sure, that's unfair, those criticisms of him. I'm not sure he really was mocking a disabled reporter. And then 6 weeks later, it's, the New York Times kind of deserves that. There's a real slippery slope. This happens in politics. It happens in life, actually. You start off in a sort of moderate rationalization, justification of something, and then it's hard to sustain that psychologically, I think. I've actually never studied this, but I'm sure there are psychologists who have. It's hard to sustain a kind of skeptical support for something. It's psychologically, one doesn't want that, one wants to be kind of for something, and so you sort of forget about the skepticism after 2, 4, 6 weeks, and suddenly you're, we need to support him no matter what, and it's terrible, these attacks on him. And so I think there was some of that dynamic in play. The attack on the media, the enemy of the American people. Everyone can cite Jefferson comments about how horrible the press is and stuff, but that is different. It was a long time ago, and some of those comments led to bad things, incidentally. I don't think we want to go through the Alien and Sedition Acts from Adams and all. Hamilton was a much more consistent defender of freedom of the press than Jefferson. I'll just point that out here for the record. To do it sort of knowingly in this day and age and the way he did it is really, incidentally, the media was not that bad for Trump. He exploited it pretty cleverly, and actually Fox helped him, but I'd say CNN, don't you think, helped him probably as much during the primaries, and so early, yeah. So he was very clever at playing the media while attacking it, and somehow you'd point this out to Trump supporters, and they didn't believe it. They thought he's not getting a fair break. Look, it happens sometimes. People get carried away. We'll see how long it lasts. That, I think, is a very interesting question. The convention, you were right to cite that from 46 to 36% or something. It's not a small drop in just 2.5 months. It's not as if the economy's plummeted. Usually you see a drop like that, and we've had a stock market correction. We've had a bad foreign policy thing, Syria with Obama. We've had Ebola. Something has been screwed up, right, to get that kind of drop. Trump's been pretty lucky. The markets are up. Unemployment is not up. There's no huge foreign policy crisis. For his numbers to drop like that tells me that his support is less solid than people think. And I think there's a little bit, I'll now criticize the liberal media in closing for a second. There's a little bit of a liberal media trope that these Trump supporters are just like weird, bizarre people from middle America, and they're just going to be loyal to the last breath. There'll be some of that. But they are reality. People are going to look around and see what's happening in the country. And at some point, if the jobs aren't coming back, if other things don't change, if his family relatives, if his relatives are getting rich, or he's appointing unqualified people to jobs and so forth, if legislation isn't changing things they don't like, I think there's a certain real world. Reality matters. I still think reality matters quite a lot in politics. And people may be deceived by some fake news, but they're not deceived by what they're being paid on their job, and whether their son or daughter is getting a job offer or not, and whether their nephew in the army is or isn't getting better equipment and foolishly being sent somewhere or not being sent somewhere, and is it being well explained? And people are sort of, in that respect, I think reality still matters. And so in that respect, I'm a little less worried about the fake news stuff than some people, just because I think ultimately the fake news gets trumped by real results.
Bill Kristol, thanks for coming.
Thank you.